Thank you very much everyone for dialing in this morning. This is the first in our series of GovNet Justice webinars ahead of the Modernising Criminal Justice conference in September. I'd just like to take a quick moment to thank our panel of speakers. So we have Victoria Knight, Francis Toye, Sir Martin Narey and Martin Jones. Also like to thank our supporters. So our headline partner is Unilink and our key partners are Attenti and Value Licensing. Our chair today is Victoria Knight. So she's the Senior Research Fellow at Montfort University. Before I hand over, just a couple of housekeeping notes from me. If anybody has the option with their camera and audio to mute that, just if you're not speaking, to make our call bandwidth that little bit better, stop any echoing, anything like that. There will be time for questions at the end. So please hold your questions till then, and you're able to submit them to our panel either in the Q&A section at the bottom or also in the chat. If you'd prefer to ask anonymously. So without any further ado, Victoria, I'm going to hand straight over to you to introduce our panel for the day.
Good morning and thank you very much. I'd like to reiterate thanks to you guys for organising this. I think this is a timely discussion. As chair today, I want to give a bit of time to introduce the panellists. The purpose of today's discussion, that we hope that sort of people that are attending to kind of reflect on I suppose these dark times that we're all experiencing, and to reflect on some of the positives or the silver linings of how justice is still managing to move and what's happening. So I think in terms of people that are attending, I think we have a really good overview of what's happening at the coalface, as it were, in terms of justice. And thinking about this in terms of a catalyst to transformation within the criminal justice landscape. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce, sorry, I'll just pull up my sheet. I'd like to introduce Martin Jones, who's the Chief Executive of the Parole Board. He's been in charge of the Parole Board since 2015. He has extensive experience working within the criminal justice landscape on senior operational and policy roles. Our second panellist is Francis Toye, is the founder and CEO of the award-winning Unilink Group, which is truly now an international company providing services within prisons, and operating and specialising in technological transformation in the criminal justice prison sector, should I say. Francis is responsible for, many of you may have heard, Email a Prisoner, which is a crucial service provided by his company. And lastly, our third speaker, Sir Martin Narey, an extensive career. I'm sure many of you have heard of Martin. CEO, he's had extensive service for prisons and probation. CEO of the National Offender Management Service in 2003. He then became the Chief Executive of Barnardo's in 2005. And as an academic, it's always lovely to see practitioners transfer to academia, and he is a visiting professor at Durham, Manchester Met and Sheffield Hallam University. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time, I know I've done formal introductions, but if we could, I'm going across the screen, there's no hierarchy here, guys. Martin, do you want to say a few words in relation to your contribution today? Sorry, Martin Jones. Yes. We've got two Martins. I'm
quite happy to be old Martin, if Martin
old
Martin. Young Martin.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everybody. Absolute pleasure to be here, and I was really grateful for the invite. I'm going to speak just for a few minutes about some reflections of the Parole Board on how we've been working during COVID-19. To provide some context for people that are zooming in for this call, important to describe what the Parole Board is and what it does. We are an independent body. We carry out risk assessments on prisoners to determine whether people can be safely released back into the community. And when we make those decisions, we are sitting as a court to decide if a prisoner's continued imprisonment is necessary for the protection of the public. The one thing we are not there to do is to decide whether the original punishment imposed by the court
I think
Martin,
we've had a bit of a glitch.
Shall I? Do you want to ask me a question,
Yes,
Victoria?
Francis. Do you want to say a little bit about Unilink and how you're fitting into the landscape at the moment?
Yeah. Well, I look forward to Martin Jones coming back.
Yes.
First of all, we've been working from home since the 16th of March, and it has its challenges, but we're doing okay in that environment. We're seeing quite significant demand for new services from prisons and from probation, particularly in messaging, email a prisoner and in payments, and also in video calls or video visits. We decided fairly early on to offer a video visit product for free for a period of a few months to try and help prisons in this crisis, because visits are not allowed to prisons, and that's been taken up in Scotland. We are visiting prisons, and because we do maintenance of devices in prisons, and I'm sort of pleased to report that things are gradually getting a little bit better. Our engineers visit with PPE, but they coordinate and work well with the establishments themselves, who are doing well to isolate cases and ensure that the disease doesn't spread. We're seeing a lot of demand in the UK and a lot of demand in Australia as well. So I'm pleased to hear there's a few people from Australia on this call. We've just started some Friends and Family Services in states of Victoria, Tasmania, and in Queensland. So, and that was just about what I was going to say, except that we also have a big contract with Norway for all their prison and probation software, and we've managed to continue that even in this crisis. So with that, welcome back, Martin Jones, and I'll hand over to you.
Okay.
I'm very sorry.
Yay!
The challenges of the technology. My Wi-Fi drops out at a crucial moment.
Oh dear.
I will try to plod on if that's okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So I was just about to explain the reality of the work of the Parole Board. Last year, we held 8,246 parole hearings, and that contrasts 50 years ago, there were no parole hearings at all. All decisions were made based on an assessment of a prisoner on the papers. Now, all of those hearings, 99% of them plus, would physically take place in a prison, in a relatively small room, with a parole panel of 3 people, normally the prisoner, his legal representative, maybe a probation officer, a prison officer, maybe a psychologist, maybe sometimes a victim reading out a statement. Now, if you were thinking of a perfect place to spread a virus like coronavirus, I couldn't think of a better one. It's extremely difficult to hold those hearings. So quite quickly, it became clear to us that in March, it would be impossible for us to continue with face-to-face hearings for a prolonged period. The other difficulty we had is a significant proportion of Parole Board members, and in particular our judicial members, are retired. So they tend to join the Parole Board at the end of their judicial career. So again, they would fall into a number of the more vulnerable groups. So we decided to pause those hearings. And at that point, we were committed to ensuring that we continue to progress cases wherever we possibly could through either intensive paper reviews or remote hearings. At the point we paused those hearings, we had over 2,500 parole hearings listed, and all of those cases needed to be assessed to see if they could be progressed by other means. Now, some people might ask, why does that matter? Well, it matters because the Parole Board makes around about 25,000 decisions each year, and we're there to decide whether people should be held in custody for the protection of the public. But of course, if we're unable to take that assessment, then that custody becomes unlawful and arbitrary. And obviously, we only want to keep people in prison where it's necessary for the protection of the public. And even though the Parole Board each year decides that probably 3/4 of the people we see need to remain in prison for the protection of the public, we do release 25% of people. In numerical terms, that means the Parole Board releases around about 250 to 300 people each month. So clearly, in a situation where there are real concerns about the spread of the virus in our prisons, if the Parole Board stops working, that would mean in 4 months, the prison population would be around about 1,000 higher than it otherwise would be. So that would be a really serious issue for the prison service to cope with. Even though it doesn't influence our decisions, it's a crucial factor that we need to take into account. So since March, we have been proceeding by way of intensive paper reviews and remote hearings. I've got to say, at the point at which that started, I was hoping maybe that I could get to a point where 50 to 60% of our cases could continue. I've been pleasantly surprised, actually. Many more cases than that have proceeded by way of either a paper assessment or a remote hearing, particularly telephone hearings, which have been the easiest to stand up in the short term, but increasingly by use of a cloud video platform to ensure that those hearings are effective. There is no sign so far of a Parole Board backlog building. Indeed, we have made more decisions in the last 3 months than we ordinarily would in an average 3-month period, and that's particularly because we've managed to accelerate through paper assessment of cases, which obviously, if you're working from home, that's the easiest thing to get through, is stuff that you can just really read on your laptop and make a decision based on the papers. Importantly, we have made nearly 700 directions for release in that 3-month period, which is almost exactly what I would have expected in that period of time. So I think that's encouraging that our decision making has not changed in the period. Indeed, the number of cases waiting for a hearing is actually down by 50%. So rather than a backlog building, we've managed to accelerate through the cases. The one thing that I really have found is I think there is enormous potential here to change the way we do Parole Board business in the future. There are particular categories of cases and in particular people that are recalled to custody for a breach of their licence conditions, where the parole process takes a very long time. And if you've got 6 to 9 months left of your sentence, what is the point of reaching a parole decision after 4 or 5 months? Because actually you're almost at the end of your sentence. We have found that we've accelerated in particular through a paper assessment of some of those simpler recall cases, make a much more early, swifter decision, and where cases do need a hearing, to accelerate that to a single member of the Parole Board making that decision on that. So I'm certain that there will be opportunities going forward to make quicker, better assessments, making sure that we make the right assessment in relation to the risk to the public. I also think it demonstrates the potential to use the technology much more widely than we currently do. And in particular, for some of the simpler cases, I mean, one of the difficulties we have is some of our prisons are in very hard to reach places. So, you know, sometimes on the edge of the North Sea camp, perilously difficult to get to, quite a way away from London, which is where quite a lot of our members are based. Much easier, of course, if you're video linking into those hearings rather than looking for members living in the local area. The other difficulty we have is psychiatrists on the Parole Board, a limited number of those. Much easier to get them maybe to a hearing in the north of the country if you've got the video working. So I think I see enormous potential to use what we've learned during COVID for the future. So thank you. I'll conclude there and pass over to the next speaker.
Martin Narey, you have served a long time in the criminal justice system. How would you respond to what both Francis and Martin Jones have just said?
Well, first of all, I hope there's some time for a bit of questioning, because I particularly enjoyed what Martin had to say there, and I'd like to follow that up later on. first of all, I think there are opportunities. This is a dreadful thing to have lived through and experienced, and some people have lost loved ones. It's been an awful time, but it's right to look up and see what can be gained from it. And I think some of those things are not just about the criminal justice system, although people who work in the criminal justice system and those who go through it, I think, will benefit. I think this experience has changed the world on work-life balance. In the organisations with whom I work, I don't have a full-time job now. I have a number of part-time jobs, including being a non-executive director of Unilink. But the organisations that I'm working with, who have been getting people working at home, have almost invariably found that much easier than they thought. It has been a real breakthrough, and I think that will help. One of the most challenging things at work, I have to say, it'd be nice to say it was for both sexes, but it's still, even in 2020, still a primary challenge for women. I think that will make work-life balance and marrying up family ties with work responsibilities much easier, because we've just had an enormous breakthrough and we're seeing how well we can do. Secondly, sorry, and I just out of amusement almost, I talk about this quite a lot when I talk to different organisations about leadership, and I track my experience of trying to make various workforces more welcoming for parents, and particularly for mothers, because of responsibilities primarily staying with women. And as I sometimes tell them, if I was clever, I'd show a photograph here, which I can't, but just as an example of how much ground we have to make up, and how very recently we have started to make it easy for women with caring responsibilities to have careers without having to be stressed by having to balance the two. I'll show a photograph of my mother when she started work many years ago at Marks and Spencer's. And my mother joined straight from school. In those days, did rather well at Marks and Spencer's, broke through a little glass ceiling, and was the first woman in the Marks and Spencer's in the Northeast to be allowed to work in the office. She was promoted from the shop floor. And then I said to people, what did my mother do sometime before I was born, obviously, which caused Marks and Spencer's to sack her? And the answer is that she got married. And that was sufficient to end women's careers. And as you will know very well, Victoria, that persisted in academia until relatively recently. So yeah. I think work-life balance is going to be really make a big breakthrough. Secondly, I would say, I think we might learn something about meeting efficiency and meeting brevity. I think a lot of us are finding Zoom a little bit tiring. And my experience, including the board meeting that I'm having with Francis and colleagues next week, we've made the decision to make that meeting shorter, made the papers a bit shorter. I think we'll become more efficient, and I think we'll carry that, we must carry that into general meeting management. And third, and this is a bit about prisons, which you might expect, I think prisons could become better places because of this, because I think it might force, not professionals, because I suspect that the people who lead the Prison Probation Service, Joe Farrer, the new head of Prison Probation Service, would be willing to do this, but politicians will be very nervous. But I think there's a real chance to make a technological breakthrough and use technology more routinely for prisons. But when I joined the prison service many decades ago in 1982, there was a fear of allowing prisoners to have FM radios, because it was said they would be able to listen to police broadcasts, and security would be breached, and people would be broadcasting on FM bands to plan escapes. Of course, when it finally happened, I think it was forced by the court, it was absolutely fine. We're now facing exactly the same suspicion about email. I'm immensely proud of Unilink's Email a Prisoner. And I think if some of you saw the testimonials from prisoners and families about that, it's fantastic. But it's still completely bonkers that an email arrives in a prison, it's printed out, handed to the prisoner. We have to allow direct communications and simply manage the security, which I know we can do. And this is my final point, the great beneficiary of that will be parenting, because it will allow more routine contact between children and parents. My kids, as you'd imagine, are all grown up. I've got grandchildren, including grandchildren who, of course, I don't see anymore because they're either in London or, in my daughter's case, in South Africa. I've discovered a little app called Caribou, which has changed our experience as grandparents. We put a children's book on the screen here. Our grandchildren in Pretoria can see the same children's book. We turn the pages together. We read them a story before they go to bed. Every prisoner should be able to do that without any difficulty with the parents, because parenting, particularly for male prisoners, goes out of the window when they're incarcerated. There's no need for that to happen. So I think we could really have prisons which are more accommodating of family ties, and do much more to help prisoners function in a real world in which email and going online is just part of day-to-day life.
Okay, thank you, Martin. Can we now, guys, move towards thinking about, and a lot of you have alluded to, you know, how things are happening in light of COVID. So how are you? I mean, Martin Jones, you've spoken quite eloquently about how the parole service are kind of, dare I use the word, overperforming now that you are keeping up with the workload. And this idea of the fact that we need to keep justice moving, and business as usual. Could you give attendees an idea of how the kinds of things and strategies that you've put in place to do this, please? Who wants to go first? Francis, you're smiling. You need to unmute, Francis.
Okay, I can talk briefly on that, and perhaps Martin Jones has gone off mute, so I think he could talk on this as well. But very briefly, we are seeing quite a lot more demand, and we're having to recruit people. I mean, demand just simply a prison. Somebody said to me, we've had 25 years of going digital, and we're trying to do the same amount of going digital in the next 25 weeks. And it does feel like that some of the time. Yeah. And the consequence of that is that I have in one or two places, severely overworked staff. And we have been recruiting really quite quickly. We've recruited, I'm not sure how many since the crisis started, but we've recruited 30 people in 2020. I think half of those since mid-March, and quite a few of those in a response to additional requests for help and services. And quite honestly, it's good to see. You know, we're here to do these things, and just would have been nice to spread it over a couple of years instead of 2 months. But you know, while there is an attitude that we will take a little bit more risk because we need to change things, we need to make things better, it's great to see, actually, and I hope some of the changes that are being made as a consequence of having to work in a different environment, that those changes will stay afterwards. And I think they probably will, and it'll be better. And I know I'll certainly take Sir Martin's suggestion of having a look at Caribou, because I have grandchildren as well. But I'll look for it not just for me, I'll look for it and see if we can find a way of prisoners using it as well. So that's my little bit on that.
Thank you, Francis. Martin, give us some insights, just the finer detail of how you've managed to accelerate due to the COVID situation.
So just a few reflections on me on the whole thing. I think some of it is about desire, actually. If you know where the parts of the system are that are not working as well as they should be. We have used this as an opportunity to try to get stuck into those issues which have historically caused us problems. So I mentioned the recall cases, which is something that I have, we were looking at before COVID, but we've really taken this as an opportunity to take the ball by the horns and really shake up the way that we look at those cases. And we've seen, based on a first assessment of those cases, 65% of the cases that would ordinarily have waited another 3 or 4 months for a hearing are potentially going to be concluded on the papers. Now, that's an incredibly powerful figure, given the fact that that means those people being kept in custody for longer, for a percentage of them, but also that's a huge cost and a burden for the criminal justice system and the parole board as well as part of that. I think the other thing that we have found is that we have tried some things that have worked, and we've had to make the best of it in relation to, for example, telephone hearings are workable. They're not perhaps the best way of proceeding with some of our more complex cases, but this video where we've got a member linking in rather like a call like this, where they're dialing in from home, has potential to really revolutionise the way in which we work. We have real potential to get through more cases in any particular day and ensure that prisoners get a much more timely hearing, and that's what we're there to do, to ensure prisoners have a timely review of their cases and hold as many hearings as we possibly can, making the right assessment in those cases. I guess the one note of caution that I would add is when we return to the new normal, I do anticipate that there will be, a considerable percentage of prisoners that will need a face-to-face hearings, and in particular, we are concerned to identify prisoners with vulnerabilities, where there are prisoners with some sort of mental health difficulty, autism, and other challenges, which mean that actually they probably do need a fair hearing with somebody sitting in front of them. But that's not all of them, and I think for a significant number, a remote hearing that is more timely would probably be a fairer or balanced way forward. The other problem that I think, looking to the future, I've seen projections that the parole board will probably need to be holding 12,000 hearings in 2 or 3 years' time, unless we change the way in which we do our business. Either I keep increasing the number of parole board members, keep increasing the number of hearings that we hold, or we try to do it in a smarter way. And I'd much rather ensure that we're smarter in the way that we use our resources and have a proportionate way and a fairer way of dealing with those cases, rather than assuming that the best thing for a prisoner is to wait 6 months for a hearing, when some of those cases could be concluded perfectly fairly on the papers without the need for the full Rolls-Royce service. I'm not sure I claim that we run a Rolls-Royce service at the moment, but certainly it's an expensive full service to get 3 parole board members to a prison with a number of witnesses attending in person, and also that brings risks to the prison and the prisoner. And actually, I think many prisoners also find it quite an intimidating experience as well. So I'm not persuaded that used in the right way with the right support and right assessment, I think a remote hearing can be just as effective and just as fair as a face-to-face hearing, provided you identify the people that are vulnerable.
Yes.
May I come in there, Victoria? Can I just ask Martin something about that? Martin, I've been a long way out of the criminal justice system in a formal role, but it used to be the case that there was some evidence to suggest that the emphasis on personal hearings wasn't leading to the best decisions. And I recall that actually the most resistant people to reducing personal hearings were parole board members, because actually quite a lot of them like the visit to North Sea Camp, even if it is in the middle of nowhere. And there's a danger that they might put too much weight on their own reception of a prisoner. So it's not just the case that this would compromise, not for all hearings, of course, and you've listed those where hearings are vital, but we might actually get not just swifter, but better decision making for a large proportion of parole decisions, wouldn't we?
I think that's totally fair, Martin. If you look at the statistics, I'm happy to share them outside the meeting and with this group. What you've seen over the last 15 years is, as we've had an increase in the number of oral hearings, and the figures for this year show that the number of hearings held for the last year is 6 times the number that was held 15 years ago. It's astonishing. 15 years ago, we held around about 1,400 parole hearings a year. This year it's nearly 8,300. It's an astonishing rise, and the argument is that is required for the fairness to the prisoner. I'm not persuaded that's always the case at all. I also think it builds in dangers around potential unconscious bias in some of those decision making. If you're looking, and you're looking, for example, at body reactions and the look on their faces, you're answering questions, you need to be a bit careful about making assumptions about that. What I would say is that we monitor our release rate from oral hearings, and what we find is that the number of people released from an oral hearing runs at roughly 49–50% pretty consistently over the last 3 or 4 years. Certainly for some prisoners, and I think in particular for indeterminate sentence prisoners, I think it's probably the fairest outcome. But for recall prisoners, I'm not at all persuaded that oral hearings are necessary. I think you could make a perfectly good assessment of some of those cases on the papers without that full hearing. But I totally agree that it's something that we need to keep a very close eye on and break down some of those cultural barriers that we have in place. I also think the system has rather sleepwalked into an expectation that every case will be determined via an oral hearing, whereas actually what we need quite often, particularly for a recall prisoner, is what address would this person be released back to, and what is the real assessment of the risk they would present if they were back in the community? Would they really cause serious harm? And that's really what we should be focused on.
Can I ask both you all about sort of monitoring this 12-week period that we've been in? What are your organisations doing to collate evidence about? We've had some questions coming through about, what are the stakeholders' views, the prisoners' views, the board members, the participants, for example. The same for you, Francis. What kind of feedback are you getting, or what techniques are you using to kind of collect evidence? Who wants to go first? Francis.
Okay. I mean, ultimately, we are talking to our customers who are ministers of justice, and they are in a different set of circumstances today than previously, and have been. I'll give you 2 examples. Both in Australia, Victoria and Tasmania have both started looking at prisoner self-service to try and improve the administration and operation of prisons for prisoners, so that they don't do so much paper handling within prisons. I mean, in a typical prison, you're ordering all your shopping, you're transferring your money from your telephone, you're organising your visitors. It's all done on paper, or it can all be done through a self-service device. I think we will see, I hope we will see more of a move to prisoners getting in cell devices. I think that's probably, it should happen. It's not cheap, but it is probably essential. And we've all been experiencing a lockdown, but with the internet, with Zoom, with telephones, with streaming TV. Now take the internet away and you've got virtually none of those. So, try that for the afternoon. That's what it feels like being in prison. Now I do think there's going to be, and we're certainly seeing it in Europe, more of a move to controlled internet access and controlled access to some internet applications. And we'll certainly be trying to help those go along. And what we're seeing during this particular crisis is more of a willingness to look and to think about these things, whereas previously they would have just said, like the FM radio example that Sir Martin came up earlier, they would have just said, no, this is not going to happen, you are going to get stuff on social media. Well, there's more of an attitude that we might take the odd risk and we might do some stuff. So, sorry, I can't remember your question, but I hope that was a useful comment. Okay.
Thank you. Martin, how are the Parole Board, what are you doing to kind of capture, evidence? Because we're, the landscape is evidence-based.
we're doing a number of things. First of all, we're tracking the outcomes of remote hearings and paper assessments on a weekly basis to understand what is happening. So if we start to see changes in behaviour, we can monitor the reasons why that might be happening. So I think that's crucial. The other thing that we've been doing is collecting some evidence of the experience of those using the system. So we've undertaken a survey of members, the majority of whom are certainly happy to sort of support a long-term use of remote hearings. I think that's quite helpful and probably helps with Martin's point in relation to the cultural difficulties. I think sometimes people are wary of doing this, but when they experience it, they discover that it's perhaps a little bit easier, and there are advantages. You know, if you want to travel to North Sea Camp as a good example, you know, for some people that means you need to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and get in your car for a long time and go through the prison security checks, but it might be easier if you could just get up at 9 o'clock and dial in for a call like this one. I think there are some benefits around that. The other thing that we've been doing is certainly speaking to prison lawyers and indeed prisoners themselves about their experience of the system. And the one overarching point is we don't make a decision on our own that decisions should take place remotely. We take on board representations from other sides. So the board will normally say, we think this case is suitable, but we will offer the prisoner and his representative an opportunity to make representations. And in some cases, we have put the hearing back in the interest of fairness because the prisoner has objected. I think the real challenge, though, that the system has is, as everybody knows, the million-dollar question is, how long are we stuck in this rather peculiar situation? I don't think there's any guarantee that the parole board will be holding face-to-face hearings in September or October. I think we need to assume the majority of those hearings are need to take place in a rather different way. So I would be worried about simply pushing cases back, forever. That can't possibly be the right outcome, and it can't be fair to prisoners. It might be about looking at the individual circumstances of those cases and finding a way of having an effective hearing, perhaps with fewer people in the room. That might be a way of doing it, so that maybe you have 1 or 2 people in the room rather than 6 or 7. Maybe that would be a way of working around that. But I agree, capture the data, capture the benefits, also capture the disbenefits of what may be working. So what you do, of course, see is the difficulties where the internet falls out and suddenly Martin drops off the call in this one. So you need to be aware of that. Although I suspect some of that is probably about the unique pressures facing the internet and fibre at the moment, because everybody's doing it. I suspect in steady state you wouldn't see that as much.
So Martin, what about from a distance you're looking at this and hearing these examples? What about these sort of ethical and moral dimensions to digital transformation? Have you got a view on that?
I think there will be areas where genuine concerns have to be addressed. I've seen 1 or 2 of the questions that listeners have been putting up about what protections can you offer in consultation with prisoners. And I stress that in the case of parole hearings, there will be some prisoners for whom it's always appropriate, but for others who it isn't. And I agree with Martin, for some prisoners, it will not be a pleasant experience anyway. They would rather their case were put forward based on written reports over their time in custody and other things. But you have to make sure you get that right, and that this is done not for expediency, but because we recognise that things can be done differently and more effectively. Overall, I think if we had more technology involved in the life of those who are incarcerated, it would make life better for them. It would make prison more decent. It would afford more dignity to people. It would be much kinder to families and visitors. It would allow parenting of those in custody, and also, because I see Peter Martin has asked an important question, it would allow the parenting of children in custody. You know, if you, goodness me, God forbid it happens to any of us, but imagine a 16-year-old being in custody and you can't have this sort of communication on an evening to see that they're all right and to talk about them and talk to them and prepare them for coming home and things like that. We make imprisonment unnecessarily harsh. And I hope that because some of the improvements we're talking about will also bring some financial savings, it might help politicians to be braver in the decisions that they make. And I'm not saying that glibly, because we have a media that will see this as all liberalisation and being too kind to prisoners and so forth. But the reality is, if we want prisons that give people a chance to change their lives, then we have to accept that we send them to, it's a cliche, but it's very true. We have to accept that we send them to prison as a punishment and not for punishment. And the more we can do to normalise that experience and keep people involved in what is a technological world, the better for the outcomes.
Victoria, you're on mute. Victoria, you're on mute.
My question was, sorry guys, what kind of messages then do you think we should be pushing out about the benefits to convince politicians and also the public, who have an important role here, around sort of the public acceptability of these transformations within our criminal justice system? It's interesting, we've also had a question about courts, and obviously that idea of keeping business moving and keeping court hearings happening. We need to keep business moving, justice moving. So what kind of messages do you think would be helpful to put out there to the public and to politicians? Martin Jones.
Well, I think the important point for me is capturing what the benefits are for the system and for participants in the system, but being clear it's not a panacea. And I see we've had a question about ensuring that we receive the right information, and the parole board is a classic case where the average parole case will be determined based on 300 or 400 pages of evidence about a prisoner, and then the hearing is essentially an opportunity to say, do you have any questions or any areas to explore around that evidence? Now, actually, to make the system more effective, you need to focus on the evidence presented to the panel to ensure that's of really high quality information so that you make an accurate assessment of that risk. And when we're now making some more decisions on the papers, that's using that on the basis that for the most part, you're probably 9/10 of the way to the decision, having read the dossier of information, and you may have some questions that you could ask, but actually you don't need necessarily to ask those via a 3-hour hearing. You could ask those perhaps via a case management hearing, perhaps by email directions as part of it. But I think once you get through that and you focus on the way the whole system works, and I think technology for prisons, is a huge issue. As part at the start of this process, we were trying to map how many prisons could facilitate video hearings, and we discovered roughly 1/3 of the prisons don't have sufficient video technology to support video parole hearings. Now, in 2020, that's astonishing. Now, we've been working with the ministry to ensure that all of those prisons that were lacking the technology have received, within about a fortnight, a video-enabled laptop, so they can hold remote hearings on the laptop in that way. That's more than sufficient for our needs. But it does suggest to me a lack of thought in relation to the necessary infrastructure in IT that prisons need to ensure that it can work properly. And indeed, it goes much further than simply parole hearings. It can involve discussions with your probation officer, your psychologist, your lawyer, and also, as people have said, your children, your family. I think we need to be a bit more agitative about how technology could improve the way that we work our prisons. I'm sure it would help with some of the problems with violence and frustration you get in our prisons, because actually people have been locked in their cells and they're going stir crazy. I think some of that could be sorted if they could speak, to their children before they went to bed. And I agree, it's not, the punishment should not be you can't speak to your children for 6 months.
Thank you, Martin. I think it'd be helpful. We've had a lot of questions from listeners, and so I'm going to diligently work through them, if that's okay, with everybody. The first question is from Umesh Solanki to all panelists, but I think, Francis, this might be a helpful one for you to answer. So what are the key barriers to getting technology into prisons, and what strategies do we employ to convince senior prison staff of its benefits safely? I've written extensively on this, so I'm kind of going to anticipate what you've got to say, Francis. We've talked long and hard about this over the years, haven't we?
Yes.
You want to give us some barriers? I think we've touched upon that, but let's flesh them out a bit.
I think, obviously, you know, from the point of view of England and Wales, there are 80,000 prisoners. If you equip them all with devices, you're talking about 80,000 devices and management and IT infrastructure to do that. It does cost some money, but there are the benefits to it. When we meet with prisons, I don't think I've ever come across a prison governor who doesn't want the technology that exists. What we're trying to do in the meantime is make that technology better and cheaper all the time, and you know, we have most of it today, but we are developing it, and what we have in 2 or 3 years' time will be more than we have today. This crisis does focus us on particular things. I think we have to make the in-cell experience, the experience of a prisoner with a mobile device like a tablet potentially, or better, a cheap and inexpensive laptop. And I say better than expensive laptop because it's easier for education if you have that. It will gradually happen, and we are seeing departments of justice come out with tenders. We recently had one in Finland, where they are demanding more and more enhanced technology. So it will come. It just takes time.
Yes. Well, I'll give you a little example. It took 12 years to introduce in-cell television to our prisons in England and Wales, for example. That whole process took 12 years from when the decision was made to introduce television sets into prison cells. It took 12 years to roll that out. And it wasn't just about providing the TV set. You know, a lot of our prisons are old, some were during that period without things like in-cell electricity. So, you know, a plug socket, for example. So I find that interesting that it took that length of time for that to happen. What we're talking about here now is different types of technology that are more interactive and demand more than just a plug socket, that you need connectivity and you need security, because it's
much easier to do it in a new prison.
Yes.
With walls that aren't 3 foot thick,
yeah.
And where you can put a cable in at the beginning.
Yeah.
But actually, Victoria, that's a very good example of the slowness of technology. But and I lived and worked through that period. There were some technological problems, and cabling Victorian prisons was difficult. But actually, it took a while, but it could be done. The real obstacle to that normalising of prison life by allowing people to see TV was political.
Yes.
Derek Lewis, I think, when he was Director General of the Prison Service, first started putting TVs in cells. Michael Howard got a lot of criticism at the Tory conference over that. The Daily Mail were indignant.
Yeah.
In the 1997 election, Michael Howard said they would be removed. When Jack Straw came into power, with all the optimism of a new government in 97 with a huge majority, he immediately said there should be a full rollout. And then from that decision, actually the rollout was very, very quick. They were in all prisons very quickly. So it's just to observe that there are some political things here. And again, I'm not having to go at politicians. I'm not having to go at Michael Howard, for whom I enjoyed working. It is very difficult when there is public pressure piled up against things which are seen to be unnecessarily liberal or unnecessarily soft on prisoners. We have to explain this in terms of efficiency and effectiveness. We'll get better prisons and we'll get better outcomes when people are released if we treat people decently. And technology has become much an integral part of decency.
Yes, absolutely. We've had quite a few questions around security, and I would like to add to that around privacy and respecting prisoners, let's say, privacy. And obviously when everything goes digital, there are digital footprints. So there's a sort of security layer, and how would your organisations respond to ensuring that? And also in terms of reassuring participants of privacy. Martin Jones, have you got something to say about all of that?
Yeah, I think you need to proceed quite carefully around security, and particularly for hearings like our ones, where there will be quite a significant amount of sensitive information about prisoners, about victims in those hearings. We have been quite cautious around that. So initially, when the outbreak started, people were suggesting, well, can't we simply use Zoom for these hearings? And obviously, you know, if you try it, it seems like it works, but actually the security isn't really what you need it to be for a court hearing of the kind that we are holding. So we've been holding hearings on the new cloud platform that has been launched recently. That meets our security needs, generally speaking, but I think you need to be cautious about that. So one of the things that we have become aware of is that is reliant on control of who is invited to those meetings. We've had to issue guidance to our panel chairs to ensure they control who has access to those rooms. And as we were talking in the pre-chat, you know, if you see somebody and you don't recognise who they are, who are they, why are they dialing in? We also have to be very careful around a victim who dials in for a hearing. How do you safeguard their personal information? You know, they might dial in, they read out a statement via a telephone call, and as part of that, can you see their mobile number? You need to be really acutely conscious of not sharing inappropriate personal information. We're very mindful of it. I think the challenge of doing things very quickly, of course, is that you know, sometimes you become aware of things as you go along, but it's something that we're certainly keeping a very close eye on to ensure that we manage that risk carefully.
Mm-hmm. And so as a result, what do you think will need to happen to policy and legislation once this transformation kicks in? Martin, well, sorry.
That's right. I mean, I think what we need is to be wary of what the risks are for this. Now, if you've got you know, a case management hearing happening, then there might be limited risk attached to that in some cases. Many years ago, when I worked in the Courts and Tribunal Service, there was a worry about people, you know, hacking into the prison to court video link network so they could watch those hearings. Now, the point I made is, well, of course they could do that, or they could sit in the court and watch the hearing, because those are public hearings. You need to be aware of what is public, what is private. Now, of course, I'm not saying it's a good idea to dial into a court hearing via the internet, but opening it up in relation to what really is going to contain very sensitive personal information versus what is in the public domain anyway, if you can go and watch it down Suffolk Crown Court.
Yes, great. Okay, Francis.
Yeah, I could just add a little bit. I mean, with every thing we do, we have to be aware of the privacy and security issues. So, yeah, we can't just use Zoom or Skype into prisons. We made a video visit call product, and the visitor has to enroll in advance, showing some identification documentation. And we started this last week in Scotland. We had a few tests, or a few live visits, which were successful. And you know, our product is carefully designed to do facial recognition of the people on it and make sure that there are no unauthorized people visiting. And the visitor showed the prisoner her dog, which the system, and this is technology for the system, decided that the dog was an unauthorized visitor and nearly shut down the call. But at least it shows that it works. Okay. Technology needs to catch up with it, but it is coming.
Yes. I'm just picking out, I'm conscious of time. We've got 4 minutes left. There's an interesting question that's coming from Matthew Previtt, who has asked the panel, how can we then think about the future in using technology more widely and innovatively to keep people out of prison in the first place? So Martin, do you think you've got a response for that?
I think there's we tended to talk about prisons today, a little bit of course, but not at all about probation. And technology has a huge scope for giving the courts more confidence about non-custodial penalties, about the safety of people in the community, about knowing where they are. There are some civil liberties issues there, but actually there's much that can be done. If we can avoid sending somebody to prison, if we can deal with them in the community, if a community sentence can fit the requirements of retribution, then we should always prioritise that. But sometimes courts are very cautious about whether or not people's behaviour while in the community, because obviously supervision is it's a reassuring word, but the reality of supervision when people are in the community is that for a large part of the time we don't know where they are and what they're doing. The scope for technology to do even more to breach that, building on what we already have in terms of electronic monitoring, is huge.
Okay. Any other
would
comments?
echo that. I'm really excited actually by the prospects of greater use of location monitoring tags to manage people in the community. The other point which I've tested and I'm a great fan of, and particularly for parole cases, is alcohol tagging. A huge number of the people that we release from prison each year and are recalled to prison each year because of alcohol misuse, and something which controls and monitors the extent to which they're drinking alcohol. There are lots of people, let's be frank about it, you know, the first thing you do when you leave prison is maybe go to a pub and have too much to drink, and that may then precipitate a recall to custody. If you could just monitor that and have honest conversations with people about what you're up to in the community, I suspect that would keep more people in the community. The other question is, you know, sometimes people will have a pint of beer, and that's absolutely fine. What you're worried about is having 10 pints and getting into a fight in a pub. That's a completely different behaviour to monitor.
I think that's interesting about sort of compliance mechanisms, but what about the rehabilitative mechanisms that technology can provide? If we could end on that.
Okay. Obviously, there are, perhaps not obviously, there are risk factors related to people. Admittedly, I'm going back to prison here, but we can identify risks of people in prison and give attention to those people. I'm not quite sure you can, and outside that, in probation, we will be looking at apps, mobile apps, to help people to operate probation. And I think generally any technology that makes the systems work better, it won't in itself rehabilitate people, but it will give those people who want to rehabilitate themselves a better chance to do so. And that's our philosophy on the technology.
And there are excellent examples of that, particularly around health and therapeutic work using technology, and also obviously e-learning is part of that rehabilitative process. I think we've reached 12 o'clock. We could keep talking about this, couldn't we? And we've had lots of questions from listeners, so I'm really grateful to all the questions. We probably need to have a discussion after this with the panel and GovNet. But in terms of timekeeping, I think we need to end the formal discussion. I'm wondering how GovNet would, I'd be happy to compile some further responses that we've had coming in, but I've been casting my eye over them, and I think we've addressed a lot of what people are asking. I'd like to formally thank everybody for participating. It's an interesting discussion, and you know, there are silver linings to this dark cloud, and it's been a pleasure to hear your input, and I wish you all well with your efforts to keep our justice system moving in a humane way.
I think it's been really great. Like you say, there's so many questions coming in that we haven't been able to address all of them. Hopefully we can address some of them, more of them offline afterwards. We'll catch up with the panel to work out how we can best do that to make sure everyone's been heard. So yeah, thank you so much for everyone for both listening and for participating. Before I go, I'd just like to mention that the recording of this webinar will be available online afterwards from early next week. So I'll make sure to email everybody with the details in case you missed any bits or you want to revisit anything. So thank you very much once again to all our panelists, so to Victoria, to Francis, to Martin and to Martin for putting it all together. Also a big thank you to Francis and the team at Unilink for their support and helping all of this in place, and to getting us all on the call today. They've been very instrumental in this whole discussion. Also thank you to Attenti and to Value Licensing for their continued support as well. So the final piece from me, I guess, is just I mentioned briefly at the beginning that this webinar precedes our Modernising Criminal Justice conference, which takes place in London this September. So it would be great to see you all there to continue this discussion, as it has been quite so lively. So if anybody hasn't already booked on, I'll send a link and a discount code that you can use. And if anyone has any more questions that they want to continue to send to our panelists, I'm sure we can arrange that as well if more things pop up. But that's everything from me. So thank you all so much to everybody.
Thank you, and stay safe, everyone. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Okay.